on this Friday the 13th Cyber Risk Engineering special YouTube live event dedicated to Protestware. My name is Yanis Pavlosoglu, and I'm here with Tom Ryan, and for the next hour or so, we're going to be discussing Protestware. We're going to take you through the definition, what do we mean by the term, and how all of a sudden it's become a contemporary term, a term that we see a lot more of. And we're going to give you some examples of Protestware and also the attacks involved. Before we start, I'd like to introduce you to our guest here today, Tom Ryan. Tom, tell us a little bit about you.
Giannis, long time no see, my friend.
Indeed.
It's been, what, 3 years? Yeah, since when we saw each other over in Westminster.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me on. It's been, it was definitely a pleasure catching up, seeing what's going on with you. So, yeah.
When it comes to Protestware, what has been your relationship with the subject, Tom?
So I get teased on this because I'm still in the application security space. How long's that been now? 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's kind of how we met each other back in OWASP. So that's what kind of made it interesting.
Those were the days.
Yeah, I mean, and we've been saying this for a while, that stuff like this was bound to happen. We were just saying when. It's not if, but when. Yeah.
So speaking of when, I recall, and so that we set the scene a little bit for our audience as well, we're going to be here for 45 minutes or so. Of course, in terms of housekeeping, please feel free to chat any questions you might have on our YouTube live chat channel. You can also ping us on Twitter, LinkedIn, the usual Instagram, the usual social media. We're going to spend 15 minutes taking questions from you towards the end. And the idea is that you leave this YouTube live event knowing a little bit more about what's happening with Protestware today. So that's it in terms of housekeeping. Tom, back to you. When did you first come across the term Protestware? And maybe it wasn't called that back then, but when do you recall your first encounter with the subject?
So it really wasn't called Protestware. Way back when, we always said open source is going to lead to people deciding to hack different repos. And it wasn't really Protestware. It's like, hey, I just found that next 0-day exploit. And yeah, let me tell you how I done it. And then we've always said, now that this is open to everyone, guess what? Sooner or later, somebody's going to put a backdoor in this code for whatever purpose. It could be criminal, it could be whatever. And that's kind of how we've always looked at it. And we always said this is going to be a nightmare because from the AppSec side of the world, guess what? There's not a tool out there that's going to detect a backdoor in code.
It's very hard to do that. I recall, to give one example, I think it was LibreOffice, one of the open source versions of Office. It could have been another version whereby if you had a specific Easter egg key shortcut type combination, you got a whole game screen up. And then we started thinking, okay, does it have its own JavaScript rendering engine within that, right? Have they just imported the whole thing? Do you recall that LibreOffice or whatever Office version it was, Easter egg type of, let's say, backdooring?
Yeah, I remember that. It was kind of funny. So LibreOffice did it, and I think they got the idea from the little Easter eggs that used to be in Clippy. Remember Clippy?
Yeah.
I'm showing my age now. So they would always hide an Easter egg in Clippy. LibreOffice had their own, and I think for a while even Google was having their own little Easter eggs, but that came to a halt. Like when you search for certain queries, something would come up.
Something would come up, yeah. And I remember spending time with people, just basically strings, nothing, too reverse engineering like, but picking up a binary and stringsing it and trying to figure out whether or not it had any such shortcuts as an incremental bundle to a specific piece of software. When it comes to starting from something as humorous or as simple as an Easter egg in open source software, not really benign, right? It's not going to cause any issue when it comes to right? It's not going to cause a concern. How do we go from that to the whole idea of planting backdoors in protest of geopolitical events? What has been the journey that you've seen in your 20 years in AppSec?
It's basically mindset. What goes on in somebody's mind. The way we've always pointed this out is, what is a nefarious actor going to do? Okay, because we built all these great tools that are out there. Think of it. How many tools have been put out by OWASP? Okay, they're built for the greater good, but how many times do you think they've been used nefariously? Same thing. Same thing with open source. It's put out there to cut down the time for development. But sooner or later, somebody's going to start realizing, hey, let's look at this. And what can I do with this? And it's done with software all the time. Look how many times people, everybody wants everything for free, number one. So what were the first things that they were doing to get things for free? They would create keygens. Those keygens would then have backdoors.
Yeah.
Right? Think of how many keygens had backdoors to them because somebody wanted something for free. And they would take stuff over. And, I've seen this happen, and sometimes it's more like a spray and pray attack. Let's just do this and see what happens.
Yeah.
Okay, because I could tell you one interesting one I've ran over to the past few years, one keygen for let's just say, a company that may control ICS controls for certain needs for people.
Okay, the ICS space.
They may have used a keygen for AutoCAD files. Okay. The problem is, guess what that keygen did? It infected every AutoCAD file that was created.
Right.
So as those AutoCAD files got shared, it then compromised machine after machine after machine.
It's a big problem when it comes to, using pirated, let's say, versions of software, but not actually using the pirate version itself, but using a generator to bypass a key or tridging or fudging a DLL file or something equivalent. And then, of course, the person who's created that specific generator or, let's say fudge, wants something in return. So they plant it, they leave it there. And then, of course, you think that you get the free version of the software, the pro version of the software for free. But actually what's happening is something much bigger. There's a whole play happening there. So Tom, just on that point, right, before we go into Protestware and recent events involving the Ukraine and Russia and what we've seen around Protestware and the taxonomies, we'll cover all that. But just I want to make sure that our viewers understand that this topic is not new. It's been around and well known within our industry, within the application security industry, within the open source space, within static analysis scanning, DAST, etc. What other names have you seen Protestware being labeled as historically?
So historically, one, it's kind of hard to really give it a different name. It's always, ones are backdoors. Then you have Protestware, which was the new buzzword, because in order to bring light to everything, you always have to have the new word for it. Just like when I started creating encrypted tunnels. Remember, oh man, I'm showing my age. Remember when the guys at Loft and the CDC started creating tools like Peekabooty? All right, so it would give you those encrypted tunnels. Okay, it looked like it was there for one purpose, but it was there for others. Now we have the whole case of Protestware as a way of looking at it as, I think the best way of say it is protest, since that's the buzzword. So how do we, go in and say, okay, we're really protesting this, but we're going to do backdoors, we'll do this, we'll do that. So they look like they're doing a protest, but a lot of times that's masquerading other things that are done.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's the most important thing, right?
Yeah, it could be saying, okay, we're protesting them. We created this backdoor. It could be hidden under some nefarious name. But they're really there to exfiltrate data. Somebody's probably in there to make some money, like everybody always is. And that's where it gets interesting.
Indeed, and there's a whole chain of command around making sure that, what seems like an innocent type of protestware, and we'll look at the taxonomies, let's say from an IP, just trying to figure out the IP that it's been launched at, then from that deriving also, other than the protest message, which is a text message, which is not malicious, but also triggering other things happening as part of the code base that's there. In typical terms, what I've seen is that the first three steps are the same, right? And they've always been the same. So it involves some sort of big import of a code base for fun, right? So we mentioned LibreOffice, you mentioned a couple of other examples. That big code base then, nobody really looks at from the developers maintaining the code because they treat it as the Easter egg or a specific, let's say, version that is there that for historic reasons. And then, of course, somebody spots that and they either exploit the vulnerabilities that are in there, or they go and they customize that big code base to their heart's content because nobody's going to really pay any attention to those commits. Does that resonate with you, Tom, in terms of that ABC 1, 2, 3 of what protestware, where protestware comes from?
Right. No, I would agree with that. And you see, that's the whole thing. And we've always looked at, so it's funny because I was just talking about some of the stuff at a presentation I was doing the other day, as far as how much developers care about security. So there was an interesting report that came out from Secure Code Warrior that basically defined it based on surveys that they've done, based on training, things like that. People are more focused on functionality than they are about security. Okay, sure. I think the number was about 14% of developers care about security because everything ends up in backlog. Right? So because of that, it makes it easy to backdoor a lot of this stuff. So when you start looking at all the different ways of doing protestware, and you and I talked about this one, from a red teamer perspective, I've always liked to look at like GitHub, GitLab, because guess what? That's open in every environment. Okay. The reason why the developers need it. So if I'm a red teamer and I'm breaking into a place, how am I going to do that? I'm going to hide everything on one of those. I already know it's open. Once I'm in, I'll start infiltrating and exfiltrating stuff there. And the big joke is, well, that's Microsoft's company. But
they've been pulled
that's
out.
kind of the way it's going. And I've always looked at it from that way because I've always had my AppSec hat on. Funny enough, I actually saw it done in real time. So I was working with a company doing AI for security operations.
Okay.
And what they were doing was they were pulled in a VPN via GitHub and then compiled it on a local machine. And you couldn't read any of it because everything was in Chinese.
Ah, okay.
Right. And then nowadays, what we've learned is, from us having that diverse background, IOCs and TTPs, that's what everybody focuses on. Well, this is what matters. I'm like, dude, once you know that, it's easy to pretend you're anybody. So you put your social engineering hat on. If I want to say I'm the Russians, I want to say I'm the Chinese, I spin up a VPN or a box over there and say, boom, 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 look, it's them.
It's very easy to impersonate others, just like compiler settings, keyboard layouts, right? It's very easy, and a couple of VPNs and you're there. So you mentioned definition, Tom, and I think it's important, and we promised our audience a definition of protestware. And there's a few definitions that have been going around. How about I have a stab at this, and then you come back and tell me how much you agree or disagree with the definition of protestware.
Go for it.
Okay, so I would say that protestware is often benign, so not malicious, right? But malware, right? So protestware is malware. It might not be super malicious, but it is malware planted in open source projects in protest of geopolitical events. Or maybe
I'd say you're dead on. Yep.
maybe not in protest with the excuse of geopolitical events, right?
Correct. Where there's noise, there's opportunity.
Yes, right. So let's talk a little bit about that opportunity. So, and I think it's very important that now that we've got through the definitions and the basics, right, we take the attacker mindset of looking at recent geopolitical events. So assume that I am an attacker and I'm reading my lovely threat intel feeds, and one of them comes in and says, there's this Excel file listing all the different types of protestware given the recent events in the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's mainly, the article says, developers of open source software protesting about what's happening, right?
Yep.
And I'm the attacker and I read this, right? How would I react?
If you were the attacker, I'd probably say, okay, let's see what's changed. I'd probably watch the current commits and see if they fix them. But the problem is, guess what? Most people don't know even where to begin to look for a backdoor.
True.
Problem number one. Okay, the experience. All right. I remember this when I was doing work with Fortify. We created this custom rule pack to try and look for it. The biggest downfall of it was about 80% noise. So because it was 80% noise, to find that 20% that was actually valuable, people just ignored it. So they said, "Oh, this is nothing." Okay.
Right.
And that was always the interesting part. Now, you have the open source community where the one thing we learned, perfect example, was from Log4Shell. Okay. It was first reported in 2013. Okay. The way we know that is from their JIRA logs, because the JIRA logs are public. The next thing we know is, I believe, when I was at HPE, the security research team kind of did a talk at Black Hat about the same exact scenario.
Right.
Same exact
2016.
scenario.
Correct. Yep.
And guess what happened in 2021? Well, boom, here, somebody finally listened and went about and did something.
Right.
Now, the biggest problem was you had to rely at that point on software composition analysis, because now it was a known vulnerability. Okay. And everybody has to realize that's its only place is for finding knowns. What about finding the unknowns? Okay. I know for a perfect example, because I've used this forever. Thank God for my time when I was over at Cigital back in 2008. Started looking at it, playing with it, and fortifying. I was like, wow. And then when I actually went to work for them and really got deep in the roots, you start to see like everything that people are missing, or the developer mindset of what's a false positive. Right. I love that word, false positive.
Yeah.
Okay. They'll say it's a false positive even if there's a mitigating control.
And I think it's going to be very interesting, right, to see how many of, and in fact, we discussed it in another YouTube live event on this channel, like how many of, for those that do static analysis or any other, or DAST, or, any of the, if you like, introspections on their code, how many actually had cases where a log4shell was previously flagged as a false positive, right? Because, who's going to exploit Java with a reverse shell on an LDAP string and, just get a class to download, right? All those steps, they just seem too complex. Plus, what you said earlier, and I like that very much, people don't realize that there's limited time when you triage code, because you have to go through, the myriads of different taxonomies and types of vulnerabilities and classify them effectively so that you're able to do your releases, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, developers looked at it as, well, there was no CVE or CWE associated with it, so it's a false positive.
Right. That's a bit cruel. Yeah, okay, that's one way to look at it. What's a more healthy way? Let's say I'm a developer listening to this talk, wanting to better the code and myself and the team a little bit, and I know that I have the tools to do so. what's a healthier approach to take?
Yeah, so that particular way, the way I've always looked at it is, look at it through a source sync or shared trace node. So there's going to be that single point of failure within the code from a data flow analysis, okay? Where if you go in and you focus on that single point of failure, if you fix that, you're going to triage lots of them. I had one particular case where that single line of code fixed thousands.
Yeah.
Criticals, highs, mediums, and lows.
That's a really good point, right? So know your code and know where you need to go and address basically whatever fix you put in place to have the biggest impact. That's really good advice. Yeah, thank you for that, Tom.
Right.
So just
Now,
looking at the
Protestware is going to be interesting because it's doing the one thing we've always feared: backdoors. Okay, and that's where it's going to get tricky because I've been saying this for a while now. We have to start treating, open source software as third-party risk.
How so?
Because it's a third-party tool. We have no idea who they are. So it could be considered a third-party risk or insider threat. Because do you know those people that are contributing to the code? You're using it, but do you know them?
And also, what's the contractual agreement that your company has with, that foundation or 501c3 or whatever the company behind, or legal entity, if you like, is behind That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that as a third party, as a solely third party relationship. But I mean, doesn't that mean that you will classify basically all open source software as third party vulnerable to your organization? So what are you left with if you do that?
No, I mean, there's ways around it. You have to have those mitigating controls in place. So for instance, one thing a lot of people do that's kind of dangerous, they'll hot link to the code directly. They won't import it, run it through, a perfect example I think is Sonatype has the Nexus firewall, okay, that helps you protect that repo. Okay, not hot linking it to GitHub and then finding out there's a DMC takedown, and then all of a sudden your whole application breaks.
Right, because you're hot linking to the code. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So let's just summarize a little bit for our audience, right? So Protestware is not something new. It's been around in many flavors, from simple, humble Easter eggs in code to backdoors to malware being planted for later use or being exploited. And then there's simple things that you could do in terms of looking at the coverage of your code. If you've got sections of the code that's basically are not being used, commits coming in from recent developers, or also if you have developer code coming in that's perhaps too complex, backing up one of the Easter eggs that you have in your code, then you're likely to be falling victim for Protestware commits coming into your repos. We also gave a definition briefly. Protestware is malware planted in open source projects in process of geopolitical events. And we've just started going through a little bit, if you like, the categories of what an attacker would look at and how we can react to that. So Tom, just looking at that attacker's psyche, let's say that I have seen a couple of commits in an open source repo which detail Protestware, and I have somehow, because I'm working as a black hat, right, credentials to a couple of the developers in that open source project, right, because of leaked credentials, because of other vulnerabilities. How would I go about exploiting that and using Protestware as an entry point to further my, malware foothold within that open source project? What would be the steps that an attacker would take there?
So I'm going to look at it at two different perspectives. Okay. So what's been the magic word that's come out lately? Sbomb. We've known about Sbombs forever. Okay. Now, how are these Sbombs presented? Okay. Are they publicly facing? So on and so forth. So if I'm an attacker, so better yet, I'll put this in a politically correct sense. So if I'm a red teamer and you provided me with a tabletop exercise, okay, I need you to attack my supply chain. So the first thing I would do is, do the standard stuff, whip out Maltego, look at who your supply chain is.
Right.
And then start looking at the various options. Then look at the Sbombs of all the tools in your supply chain.
Right.
Now, how would I find out this stuff? Now, there's two tools I've learned that are the most dangerous tools in the world to give an attacker. Sales software and marketing software. Okay, that's why when you start hearing of the ransomware gangs being like corporations, this is where it makes the most sense. Because from that perspective, from a sales tool, now I will be able to know a lot about your organization.
Right. Okay? How you do business. Yeah.
Right. I will know who your sweet spots are from a relationship analysis perspective. I will see who you go out for drinks with, meaning, hey, is this person going out with this vendor? Okay, they use that. Let's look at their sales records. Okay, let's look at their software. Okay, what's the SBOM associated with that software? What vulnerable components are in that software? Is it easier for me to become a contributor to that software and backdoor that software? Or is it easier for me to find their GitHub repo and compromise that?
Yeah.
And then find a 0-day that nobody knows about.
And often that path of least resistance, right, is that GitHub repo that's specific to a third party or even fourth party. And I've done plenty in the red team space. Never once can I recall a scope for a red team test that's targeting third parties of a company, right? The way that you described it, because basically it would be game over, right? It would just be game over to start with. I would say, like a red team that doesn't succeed there would really suffer. So very much agree with that approach, and also the fact that you've got an SBOM that could be used by a malicious attacker to see how hard or easy it is for them to gauge, whether or not they attack one avenue or another. How else, though, would you go about looking at this as an attacker, right? So that's one perspective. You said there were two. What was the second one?
Well, one was through the Sbombs. The other one is through the people.
Okay. So social engineering?
Okay. Right. So think of it this way. Now I find out who your core developers are. I see which repos they commit to. And I compromise their account.
Right.
And then I start doing commits as them.
Right.
Because when you do it to the supply chain hack, and this isn't hypothetical, this has happened. Okay. Now as a developer, I'm making these commits. As I'm doing the commits, it gets put into the supply chain. It passes prod, passes all the SAS and DAS scans, no problem. Same thing with the next phase. Well, guess what? Now it's going to prod, and guess what it's doing in prod? The one thing else it's doing in prod when you take that approach, now it's putting your certificate on it. So it is saying this is a GA release. Now you have these backdoors in your GA release.
Now it's a big deal. In fact, I would take it one step further. Completely agree with both those points. And the second point I prefer more, actually. But I would take it one step further, that I could also be a malicious actor that wants to backdoor a specific piece of software. So through the SBOM, I look at the specific dependencies that you have. I find a not so well maintained repo library, which is there being used. I go through and prove myself, in inverted quotes, as a skilled developer within that group through the course of 3 or 6 months if I have the time. And bang, the next version is a commit that basically involves the backdoor, which is very subtle as well. You could do some obfuscation. It doesn't have to be, obvious that you're backdooring the code. Then I just wait for that dependency to be pulled in by the software in the next GA, and voila, game over, right?
Yep. And this is really, yeah. And, from hypothetically speaking, because I don't know if this was the process for SolarWinds, we saw they got in through JetBrains. We saw they did this, we saw they did that, and then just started the rabbit hole go down.
Yeah.
So my theory, I'd be curious, to look and see how that one was done, as well as a couple of others, because I've tracked at least 36 that started from GitHub, and that leaves two options: were their credentials compromised, or is there a problem with GitHub? From when you're looking at it from that lens, because this is an IAM problem or a GitHub problem.
What's caused
I've seen
actually?
plenty of them.
Yeah, it's
But then there's
very true.
the other third scenario that I have seen happen more often is they'll copy it to a private repo, because guess what? Developers like copies of their code. Okay.
Right.
Everything they've created, they always like a copy. So that could be in a private repo, and some people are too cheap and it's in an open repo. They don't want to pay
That's
the
what you
fee.
mean. Okay. So instead of it being private, it would be open, but it would just be a fork of, the main version.
Yep.
Yeah. So you mentioned, and we're just coming up to the half-hour mark. So as we're approaching Q&A, I think we've got a few questions that have come in. I've got 2 questions that have come in on social media. Feel free to use our chat, everyone. We'll come to the questions that you're asking a little bit later in 15 minutes or so. So you mentioned, Tom, that there's different types of, if you like, methods to get in, right? And we've been through a couple of these scenarios. And for recent events, if we just focus on what's happened with Ukraine and Russia this year, on Protestware, I've seen Protestware on from Clean My Mac to parts of Node IPC to parts of PHP libraries, mainly non-malicious Protestware, right? Whereby the detection is some sort of, if the IP or the temp locale or the keyboard layout or the coordinates of the running code are in Russia or Belarus or something like that, then come up with a message, right? And we've seen it on WordPress plugins as well, mistapes, the list just goes on and on and on. And there's people tracking these, and we've done that analysis on the taxonomies. From those categories, Tom, what have you seen as the main, if you like, types of protestware for this year's events, right? For what we're seeing thus far happen and unfold in 2022.
Right. So the Node one was kind of interesting to me because of how much it's used. The other one that was a little scary to me was the Team Viewer one.
Oh, yeah. Tell our audience a little bit about the Team Viewer Protestware.
So the reason why Team Viewer one comes up interesting for me is because one thing. It's always, so how long have we been having the fight between cyber and physical security?
Still going.
Right? You talk to a cybersecurity guy, they'll say, you're using TeamViewer, get that thing off my machine. But the physical security guys use it all day long.
True.
Okay. So now you're giving access, because everyone, code's sloppy, depending on where it's deployed, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't mean it's perfect. Okay. Now, what if there was a backdoor in, say, TeamViewer, or somebody had access or whatever, however they're doing it? That one gives you controls to all types of building systems.
Yeah.
Okay. If you over here in the US, it's used to control the camera systems. It's used for, because people don't hire security professionals. They hire their IT guy to be their security professional. All right. So from that, now you have access to the fire systems, the flood systems, the camera systems. Oh, yes. And the badge systems, which also have everybody's PII. Okay. Yeah. Now think of it. Do you think that's done at a hospital? Okay.
So it gets very interesting where you have, instead of compromising a user, right, or a system, you compromise a bit of software that allows remote access, which is not the approved remote software as well, right? Something like a misconfigured TeamViewer or because you could also have cases where TeamViewer, if set up correctly, right, if you do 2FA and you do all the rest, it's pretty hard to crack.
True.
But at the same time,
And that's the
default
point.
password TeamViewer, right, set up by security teams without any cybersecurity in mind, doesn't go a long way to securing that. For me, when it came to Protestware and seeing TeamViewer on the list of Protestware, it was just another nail on the coffin, right? But at the same time, TeamViewer are huge, right? They're making
Right.
enormous amounts of money. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. So how should I take that as a cyber professional? Is there an action for me when it comes to seeing a list of software that has, Protestware labels on it, given geopolitical events of this year? What should I be doing?
I would probably be monitoring the usage of it, how it's accessed. So putting my security operations side hats on, what are the controls in place for this piece of software? Okay, it's on this hit list. What are the controls in place? Are there nefarious users? Okay, that's the other thing. Because you have to remember, if it's targeted only for Russia or Belarus or wherever, guess what? You think they don't VPN into other countries to pretend they're from somewhere else? I mean, come on.
So I think I could still spoof an IP address to a good standard, right? So that's a
Right, you may
control.
be blocking them, but guess what? You may have a lot of business out of China, and they're rerouting everything through China in.
That's very
Okay,
true. Yeah,
they're not
indeed.
blocked from China. Okay, they're not blocked from India because guess what? They do a lot of work for India as well. I mean, because the one thing a lot of people didn't look at from the geopolitical sense, all right, how many businesses had teams in Ukraine and Russia that were implicated by this? Okay,
Quite
we
a few.
saw what happened with Conti. Okay, the Conti guys, you had the Ukrainian guy on the team that just starts spitting out, all the personal information of people.
Hmm.
Okay,
Yeah,
and it got to the point where the U.S. is offering $10 million reward for
right.
him. Okay,
And all that because they couldn't agree the amount, right? That they should pay this guy in terms of Bitcoin or Monero or whatever was the nominal value for the latest bit of command and control that he did. Yeah, indeed. So if I look at the taxonomies that we have, you mentioned a few, I mentioned a few. I just want to make sure that we spend some time on the categories of taxonomy. What do we mean when we say taxonomies of protestware?
where I guess when you're looking at the taxonomies, where is it being used?
Yeah, and how? Yeah,
Okay,
correct.
right.
So let's enumerate them. Let's see what we have as
So
the main
the one
taxonomies.
the one that came up that's interesting, that's widely used here in the U.S. I wouldn't even call it protestware. I wouldn't even know what I would almost call it protestware for the same reason. We put sanctions on it, and it impacts a lot of people in the U.S. So Kaspersky, they're a Russian company. We banned the usage of it, but how many people in the U.S. actually use it?
Right.
So now by banning it, you've disabled their ability to protect themselves. What happened if they had a 3-year agreement and they've out all that money now? Are they going to be able to reinvest in different, endpoint protection or whatever?
And they have to spin
Or
up a new contract fairly swiftly. So that means that, the other companies that are not on the sanctions list are probably rubbing their hands saying, we're going to get more customers.
right. So it's just different scenarios like that. Now, would that be considered a protestware?
Probably
Not because
not.
there's a backdoor in it, but you've disabled their security because they can't get updates to that if they're using Kaspersky.
Yeah, true. Plus, they need to, if they're ISO 27001 or equivalent certified, they need to show that they're not using software that's on some sort of ban list by the government in the country that they're in. I would say the main bit of um, analysis of protestware focuses on if a bit of code is running on an IP address or on a locale that is in the well-known IP address spaces for Russia and Belarus, or the locale of the actual operating system is the same. And that seems to be the trigger on the analysis that we did. It's a few weeks old now, and there's many more types of protestware coming up that basically if the IP address is in Russia or Belarus, or if the temp locale or locale otherwise is there, then there's some sort of message or equivalent trigger. Do you think that's something we could detect fairly easily in terms of, building that knowledge and not having false positives of detecting protestware?
So finding it's probably going to take a little bit more research. The question is, who has the time right now? Because every security team I know is kind of stretched a little thin.
True.
That's the one thing, and it is on the priority list is the other thing, because there's so many other things that are out there that nobody's even looked at. Okay, so I'll give you a perfect example. It was on the radar, and then Log4Shell came out. So do you remember University of Cambridge and Napier? Yeah, it was University of Cambridge and University of Edinburgh did the research on Trojan sources. Bidirectional Unicode exploits.
I think I remember that. Yeah. This was a few years back, right?
No, this one came out last year. It was probably about the October-November timeframe. And they were going to run a POC code on it by about December, January. Then Log4Shell came out, and it went quiet.
Yeah.
But it's funny because I started seeing lots of exploits come out for it from like pen test teams. I was saying, I got this, I got that. And here's the Burp Suite plugin for it. And here's this one. It disappeared. And the problem is sometimes there's just so much noise. Research teams say, is this a priority? Should I do this or what? And that's where some of these issues come into play.
If I was a CISO at a firm, what would be my suggested actions when it comes to protestware from the recent geopolitical events? What can I do? What steps can I take, given that I have overworked teams, as you said? What's my ABC that you suggest?
So, interesting thing came up. So this SCA company, Debricked, is out there. It's small, not known, but they were focusing on a piece on community. So who are the people contributing the code?
Okay.
So who are the people contributing? And then when was the last time that package was updated, which is kind of important. Okay, the reason why, if you saw the latest Android exploit that came out, that was a package that was 11 years old and hasn't been updated since.
Yeah.
Okay. So building is starting to think like that. Then when you have these packages where you're suspicious, you can actually do a little OSINT on all the contributors.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be big threat intel, right? You can just have a look what's going on in the latest releases. So point number one, actually, to make sure that our audience hear this, is you need to, as a CISO, you need to engage with the developer dependencies that the in-house code has, right? And not engage at the SBOM level, but actually engage at the level where either you're doing OSTIN or you're doing basically the CISO tools and suite is being used to see whether or not you're impacted.
Yeah, and it shocks me nowadays. I still have bumped into people who haven't checked for Log4Shell yet. And I'm like, wow.
Really?
No, really. And I'm like, you do realize you could do it for free to start. If you don't have it built into your program, OWASP dependency track will find it for you for free. It's not going to give you a
bunch of tools out there for free. I found the best one to be the Lunasec one that we had their CEO here on this channel as well, talking to us about how they came up with the term Log4Shell. And it's just a client. You just, fork a repository, you run it, bang, right, done.
Right.
In fact, it even has the remediation in it of just removing the relevant class file if it finds it, and it's all for free.
But so it's not the Gartner report, so they won't know.
That's too funny. Right. We're 45 minutes in. Let's see if we've got any questions from our audience. I can see that we've got 2 questions that have come in. So if you've got any additional questions, feel free to type them away on our chat or use social media. Right, so Tom Ryan, first question. Let's see how you do with this one.
Oh boy.
Do you think Sbombs should be made private and not be released in future?
So my point is they should only be released to customers of the particular product. Or in the case where you're in a POC and I ask, yes. If it's open to the public, that's where it gets tricky.
That's a really good point.
That's my personal view on that one. I mean, there's certain things that need to be out there and other things that don't.
You're absolutely spot on. And any new exposure where we haven't yet worked out what actions we need to take as cybersecurity professionals needs to be approached from an organizational perspective with just a pinch of salt and not necessarily publishing SBOMs. I recall back in, this is going to show my age now, but early 2000s, people were, exchanging Nmap scans of their internal networks. They were like, oh, what do I do with this port? Oh, should I filter this? Should I do that? Right? And there was a kind of like a small movement around, well, actually, how much of that information should you be giving away? And that led to now having very good reporting and also knowing, straight away if you see a telnet port open that it shouldn't probably be open to the internet without somebody accepting the risk or if there's valid reason for it. Given that we haven't done the same for SBOMs yet, right? We don't know what actions we should be taking. Plus, an Nmap scan report, relatively small given how big, an SBOM can be in the thousands
Have you
of
seen
lines
where
of
that's
code.
gone since then? No. So the interesting part you brought up about the Nmap stuff is it had to go to court to validate that it was legitimate. It's not illegal to do an Nmap scan. And the only time it gets illegal is when you find a port open and then you're trying to illegally connect to that port.
Yes,
So they
I
had to get
recall that.
specific on those terms. And now you see platforms like census.io where they literally scan the internet like every day or every other day. And it's all kept in this repo. So you can go in there and look for everything vulnerable to Log4Shell because it knows.
Yeah. I mean,
And a simple query.
Another favorite one that I have there is that people go back and sort of either make their repo private or just do an update and they fix it, but then they forget the history and they claim that they never had the vulnerability. and you just go back to the commits and it's like, guys, like, can we have an honest conversation now? Because either make your repos private or don't make such statements. So that's really interesting. All right, question number 2. And we've got, I think we've got one more after this. So if you've got any additional questions, please feel free to type them out. Question number 2, when it comes to protestware categories from the Russian attack in the Ukraine, is there anything new that you've seen compared to what was happening before? Interesting. That's a good question, actually.
Yeah. I would say it has. I haven't seen anything change. Like when you brought up the WordPress plugins, that's always been a target. Always, always, always. I can't tell you how many. Like the one we had in our list, if you turn around and you look at it, they've deleted it. Which, okay, smart. But WordPress plugins are always the keys to the kingdom because guess who spins them up? Whenever they talk about dark IT and everything else, it's always marketing because everything's in WordPress. It's fast, it's easy. Boom, let's spin them up.
And it doesn't take like 3 months to take it through the process of a big corporation. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
And I figured it's probably, I mean, even in that case, I would probably just take it and spin it up in a Docker container. So if you have to do a change to it, boom.
That's interesting, actually, because I hadn't made that correlation, and you're absolutely right that most of the names that we see on the list of protestware is the usual suspects, right? It's your team viewers, it's your PHP plugins, it's your WordPresses. That's a really interesting.
PHP's been a nightmare since its inception.
Yeah, apparently it gotten more secure. I find that hard to believe, but apparently it has. All right. Next question. Do you believe that code should be taken off GitHub and personal repos, that companies should pay for best security practices and code security? This came through our chat channel.
Yeah, that's always a tricky one because and this has been a hard one for me because what happens when you're a small company and what are you trying to do? Okay. I have my GitHub repos, work has their GitHub repos. You know, security is then left into your hands, but it also, guess what? Like every other company, if they're doing their due diligence, you still have to test it. You know,
And
everybody,
are they doing that, right? That's the important thing. Are you
you have to
doing the due
prove it.
diligence? Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and that's the hard part because then it comes down to, okay, I'm testing it, is the requirement. And it's funny because I was just answering questions about this on LinkedIn before. It depends on the tool, the process, and the person that actually did the testing. Because
It's
think of how
true.
many times you hire a pen test company.
And look,
Okay, you think,
frankly, if you take something like Log4j and you hired me as a tester, like pre-2016, to look for vulnerabilities before the CVE was published, not the CVE rated 10 out of 10, but another, I'd probably miss it, right? Because it's such a vast library. It has so many API calls. Like, where do you begin, right?
no, exactly. But that's the whole thing. And then, you know who I blame for this? And I know there's a few of them on here right now.
Go on.
Lawyers,
What do they
because
have
they
to
put
do
those.
with actually
They
taking
always
code
put
off
these
GitHub?
controls. They put these controls in place. You can only do this. You can only do that. And you know, I never really cared. I would always be the sacrificial lamb and find it and report it, and then deal with the consequences after. And then after what happened with Coal Fire, I'm like, oh, I'm not playing that game anymore.
Yeah. All right. So I think we've got one last question that has come in while we've been taking questions. Okay, we get that protestware is only something new. Is not, sorry, we get that protestware is not something new, but are you taking away from the geopolitical events in terms of the protest that is being raised? Sorry, there I was reading it for the first time. I can read it again if you want.
No, I don't think we're taking away from it. I think what we're doing. So here's how the value of protestware is it's actually given it a term and it's brought it to everybody's reality. Think of how many things that we've known in this world that nobody else realizes. Okay, I could tell you right now, I've got when Log4Shell first came out, I'm like, I went to a couple of reporters that, you know, I know at certain news outlets. They're like, well, what's that matter to us? I'm like, well, it kind of impacts about 60% of the internet. How's that?
Right, right.
Well, are they going to shut the internet down? And they're like, well, I don't know. And then the editors always shot it down. And this is the big ones that are out there. I'm like, okay, whatever. So when it shut down and you could no longer sell your ads, then tell me you weren't warned.
And look, I think with the recent geopolitical events, I hate to say this, but actually just looking at the silver lining a little bit, right? If one positive thing that's going to come out of what's happening, I know that, you know, there's a lot of misery and death and war is always ugly, but if there's one positive thing here is that actually we just start to understand a little bit our dependency on each other, and especially when it comes to software. The fact that we have a whole movement that has spun off in the last couple of months and a term now called protestware is probably a good thing, because it's going to ask the question, Tom, that you said, right? What code am I using? Where is it coming from? Who's committing this code? Is this code that I can trust or rely on? And I think that those are important topics in terms of just the whole trust and verify that we have as cybersecurity professionals that not necessarily other professions have, right?
Mm-hmm. My only fear of this, it's going to become a new thing in Gartner, And Gartner will be like, do you protect against
The
protestware?
quadrant. Yes.
Yes.
There's going to be a Protestware quadrant.
And then some marketing team is going to come up with the best pitch in the world. We protect against it.
So it's going to be like, I can tell you the dimensions right now. It's going to be protect, not protect, known, unknown. And you're going to have the whole of WordPress malware, Protestware at the very top, right? Because it's unknown and can be easily backdoored, and it can have a massive impact, right?
Yeah. I make a joke about lawyers, and I've gotten 3 texts from lawyers complaining to me about making jokes about lawyers. And they're like, YouTube won't let me comment right now.
Well, they can join our chat and ask any questions that they want. Well, Tom, it's been great having you on. Time flies, right? When you're talking about stuff that we consider interesting. I think it's been a very lively discussion. We've had people commenting on chat. One person got dragged into a meeting and still kept this live event on because they found it interesting. So we hope that person doesn't get into trouble while they're in the meeting during this live event. Thank you to all that have participated. And Tom, thank you for your time today.
No, thank you.
All right, that's it from Cyber Risk Engineering this time round. Until next time, that was our update on Protest.